Hey guys, happy early December 2024. I'm just in my snake room. Just got done feeding that boa litter. My 15 Guyana boas over there, and that made me think of the idea to do this video, which is called "It's Not Your Fault: Some Reasons Why Your Baby Snake Might Not Be Feeding." And these are just things that I want to talk about and mention to you that are reasons why your snake might not be feeding, and they are reasons that are not your fault. There's things you can do about them, but that doesn't. I think a lot of times when we talk about a snake that won't feed, people generally point to your husbandry. And I don't think that's wrong, but I don't think that that's always the case. It's kind of like shedding. I think most of the time people have problems with shedding. They point to, other people will point to your husbandry, which is probably true, but there are reasons why you could be having bad sheds that have nothing to do with your husbandry. So the point of this video is that if you have a baby snake, in particular one that's new to you, and it is you're having trouble getting it to feed, these are reasons why it might not be feeding that are outside of your basic husbandry. So rule out husbandry issues first, and don't just say my husbandry is perfect. Go double check your temperatures, make sure something hasn't changed, make sure your heating mat hasn't failed. Listen to the other people that you're asking, because I think that there's two ways to look at this question. Like when you see it on social media groups, is some people will come in and post a question. My snake, my Dumerals boa, actually it's pretty common to have Dumerals boas that this is the question about, isn't eating. And then people say, well, what is your husbandry like? Or check your husbandry, or they will say, give it a quail. And so the idea is that the reasons that the snake won't eat is either because one, it is your husbandry's off, or two, you aren't giving it something that's real high value prey. And I think that those can be causes of a non-feeding snake, but I'll tell you that I don't always think they are, and I think that that's less often the case than people would like to think, because there are things that you can't see and that are hidden, that are out of your control in some degree. So basically, the reason I pulled out a Dumerals boa is because these are known to be really reluctant and soft feeders as babies, and people will tell you to make sure they're getting one that's feeding specifically on rodents. And then people will say that if it won't take rodents, they'll tell you that to offer it a quail, and quail is the golden ticket. And quail are definitely high value food for a lot of snakes, and boas and pythons in particular. However, I will tell you that in my experience, I've owned 7 Dumerals boas in my life. 4 of them I got as unfeeding or unstarted babies from people. Quail worked well to some degree, but it wasn't like, boom, that was just the golden ticket. It still took a lot of tomfoolery and trickery. And also I probably could have started them without quail. So I just want to put that aside, that I think in general, when something won't eat a specific prey item, trying something else or trying a live version of that can be a little higher value and can help you get along down the road. But I will tell you often that in general, I think that something that will only eat one type of prey or is very picky about the prey, I view that more as just generally soft feeding. So let's go into the 3 reasons I can think of, I guess 4 reasons I can think of as to why your snake might not be feeding that aren't your fault. And the first one is that you have you've purchased a boa or a snake from somebody who rushed it out the door. And so I think we talked about it, people will say, fully started on frozen thawed, has had 5 meals, okay, great. Or I think even back in the day it was like 3 meals, and then it was out the door. And I think that probably 3 to 5 meals, especially places that have a lot of turnover and a lot of sales, so they can move their animals pretty quickly. I think they're probably targeting 5 meals and out the door. And I think that that's an industry standard, at least as a minimum industry standard. But I will tell you, just from experience, starting multiple clutches of snakes, multiple litters of snakes, starting soft feeding animals, that 5 meals is not enough to get a really established feeder in a lot of cases. Sometimes you'll have great feeders at 5 meals, and they're enthusiastic. But a lot of times I don't really see that really strong feeding response turn on until like 10, 15 meals. That's just been my experience starting the boas that I've started the pythons that I've started, is that you'll have some that are great feeders at 5 meals, but really to see that whole meat of that litter come in and be really strong feeding, I'm talking about like 10 meals, 15 meals, consecutive without them being refused. Maybe 5 consecutive meals was a decent standard, but if you just get 5 meals into it and send it out the door, I'll tell you, like right now, that Guyana litter that I have, they're 7 weeks old, and I just had the early feeders take their 5th meal, but it's kind of something like this. I have 15 of them. 14 of them have fed. One of them is giving me trouble, and I'm a little bit concerned about it. I'm going to have to up my antics on that. But 14 of the 15 have had 3 to 5 meals. But I'll tell you that it's not 5 consecutive meals, like every time I'm offering. It's like if I offer that whole group meals, of those 14 that are feeding, maybe 12 of them will take it at a time. So it's because they're not fully started yet. It's just that at 5 meals, they're not fully started. At 5 consecutive meals, they're much more likely to be fully started. Incidentally, 5 consecutive meals is probably when you get it to 10 to 15 meals total. But that's just a point I would make to you, is that rushing out the door and getting a marginally started snake is a good reason for you to come home and struggle getting it to feed, because a couple of things. One, just the stress of the move, no matter what, even if you're a perfect and expert keeper, your situation can be different, and oftentimes your situation is a little less ideal than the breeder situation where they've just had these animals and have themselves really tuned in. I'll just tell you here, not to say that this is a perfect care situation, but I'm just pretty tuned in. This is a private room only for snakes. There's no other activity that goes on in here. I have very tightly controlled parameters, and I basically know how to take care of them. So that's, in general, that's a little bit more than most people are experiencing. And so if you get a marginally started snake and you take it home into you're not the situation that it was living in, you could have it get off a feed. And basically, the way to get them back on a feed, people get them back going, but it's just that as a breeder, I feel like by the time I hand it to you, it should be snatching prey off of tongues, frozen thawed off of tongues, okay? And I just think that that's not the experience that a lot of people get when they buy from people that rush them out the door. And fundamentally, guys, you have to understand that there is some psychological and metabolic momentum to feeding. In other words, feeding begets more feeding. Any feeding begets more feeding. And that's just a general thing that I'm going to make this point in the next reason why it might not be feeding, is that anything that you feed, anytime you can feed your animal successfully, it makes it more likely to feed in the future. It makes it more likely to go from live to frozen thawed. It makes it more likely to go from only eating quail to eating rodents. Any feeding is good feeding in terms of getting them started in general in feeding. So that's what I would tell you, is that I just generally classify everything as soft feeding rather than, oh, it only eats live, or it only eats quail, or it only eats if it's warmed or whatever. I just generally classify it as small feed, as soft feeding, and my goal is to get feeds repetitions into that animal to get more feeding. And so now the second reason why you might be running into problems, that this close-up shot of getting your animal fed, feeding, is kind of the opposite reason. It's that they rushed it out the door. And this is that they've warehoused the animals, or they've maintenance fed the animals. And I think that this is something that you're seeing a lot with ball pythons now, and all animals, to be honest, because the market has slowed down a significant chunk since the hot market and the COVID, is all animals are sitting in collections longer. But I think this is particularly acute in ball pythons. I think it's particularly acute in more commodity type animals like morph boas and things like that, is that these breeders, are taking longer to sell through their animals, and that means that they're holding onto them longer. And part and parcel to that is that there's ongoing care, there's ongoing costs, and and as they grow, there's upcaging requirements. So there is an incentive to idle feed or maintenance feed animals when you know that they're not going to be sold quickly. And this basically means that you're feeding them enough to sustain life. It's not necessarily unhealthy, it's not necessarily abuse or neglect, but you're feeding them enough to sustain life, but you're not really feeding them enough to get them fully ripping in terms of metabolic and psychological momentum. And so you're idle feeding the animal. And it's basically, you can think of it like this. If you take I'll just use a ball python for example. If you take a hatchling ball python and you get it up to the point where it's feeding, and you can't sell it in the first season. And so you're like, all right, well, I'm going to go down to idle feeding this. And now instead of feeding it in a mouse weekly, you're feeding it a mouse every other week. What's going to happen is that animal's metabolism is going to slow way down because it's going to sense that scarcity. And it's kind of the analogy that people use is it's kind of, it's like if you only start an old diesel truck once a month, it's just not going to run as well as if you're starting it once a week or a couple times a week. And so when you're feeding something weekly, it's like getting that motor up and running, and it means that it's going to be it's going to run well, and it's more consistent and flat, higher metabolism. But when you're idle feeding or maintenance feeding the animal, you're like, I'm down here because there's no calories, and oh, I have to start up and get my digestive system going. It takes me longer. That meal's harder on my system, and then now I'm back down into idle. And I'm going down here and then back up and down. And so that maintenance feeding does a couple of things. One, it actually ramps down their metabolism. And the same way that you can feed something more frequently, smaller items to keep their metabolism higher or increase their metabolism, you can ramp down metabolism by feeding them infrequently. So it's one of the reasons why people are talking about, like, I slow grow my boas, and they are getting, one of the reasons why they are saying that they need to slow grow their boas or slow feed their boas is because they are feeding them so infrequently that their metabolism is dead low, and so they will use the calories that they are given very efficiently. Whereas if you feed them more frequently, they're going to take those calories and burn through them at a higher rate. But the same thing happens when you're maintenance feeding animals, is that they just kind of get idle with their metabolism and also idle with their psychology. They're just a little less avid about food. In this collection, when I feed this collection heavily in the summer, they just get more avid about food for 3 reasons. One, it's warmer, so the metabolism is higher. 2, I'm feeding them frequently and smaller, so that's helping their metabolism hum along at a really high rate. This is, if you're really curious about this, go look at Ancient Reproduction, Bob Guerrier's website about Feed Your Snake Skinny. He talks about this. And the third reason why in the summer is because psychologically they're just really motivated for food because they're in that food thinking mode more frequently. So the opposite reason from rushing a baby out the door why you could be having trouble is you could have gotten a warehoused or maintenance fed baby. The third reason I will tell you why you might be having some issues is some sort of underlying health issue, either your cause or caused by you or caused by the breeder or just because. And that's something that I will just tell you is different than your husbandry. If you have an actual health issue going on, you need to be able to recognize it and attend to it. Don't expect a snake that's got a bad RI, a respiratory infection, to be feeding regularly, things like that. Resolve those health issues first before you work on feeding them and things like that. So always consider a health issue in addition to your husbandry. And the last reason I will tell you why you might be struggling to get your animal to feed that's not your fault is that there are babies that just don't like to eat. I ran across my second true red tail that just doesn't really want to eat. It's a pain in the butt, and I'm starting to get concerned. It's not failing yet, but I need to get meals on it at 7 weeks old. I need to get meals on it, or it's not going to do well. The rest of its siblings are obviously growing and doing much more, much stronger, and more robust because they've had those 3 to 5 feed cycles. So there is a chance that you're getting, I don't even think they're failure to thrive because I think that word is thrown around too much, but there are animals that just don't adapt as well to captivity in our captive prey menus. The reality is now that we're getting into multiple captive generations, we're seeing less and less of it, but these are essentially semi-wild or wild animals, and not all of them are as well suited to captivity as others, both mentally and physically, and that shows even within the same litter. And so you might be running across one that's just a real soft feeder, and the only thing you can do like that is hopefully you won't run across that, because hopefully the breeder will find that out and disclose it to you and not sell it, or you're just going to have to try to limp along and hopefully get it going. I've had one other boa that just didn't want to feed for me, and it ended up not doing well, and it failed and it died. So there are cases that happen like that, and I will tell you that that wasn't husbandry, because every other boa that I've kept in exactly the same way has eaten. So and started under my care. So it just is what it is. But I'm putting it out there that those are the reasons why your snake might not be feeding that aren't your fault. And the only thing you can really do in these situations is to try all the techniques, try to get any feeding cycles. And if you want it to feed on mice, but it will only eat quail, feed it quail. Maybe 6 months from now, it will switch over to mice, things like that. Any feeding is good for a snake that you want to build a stronger feeding response, and any feeding builds psychological and metabolic momentum and moves you towards your goal. So that's the only thing you can do besides obviously ruling out the health issues and making sure your care is on point. So I just put that out there for you, and I appreciate your attention, and I hope that it gives you some ideas why if you're sitting there frustrated with your baby.